Hold a French gold Napoleon from 1871 in your palm. Feel its weight, exactly 6.45 grams of pure 900 fine gold. The inscription reads, Napoleon III, Imperial Napoleon III, Emperor, Napoleon III, Emperor. It was minted in the Paris money in January 1871, during the final weeks before the Second Empire collapsed into ash and humiliation. But this coin represents something far more sinister than a fallen regime. It represents 1/5 billionth of France's future. Not a symbolic gesture, not a diplomatic settlement, a calculated extraction designed to bleed a nation white over decades. 6 weeks after Napoleon left the mint, Otto von Bismarck stood in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and demanded something unprecedented in European history. 5 billion francs in gold, not a tribute, not reparations in the traditional sense. Financial occupation. The number was obscene. 5 billion francs equaled approximately 25% of France's entire annual economic output. It was 3 times the gold reserves held in the Banque de France. It was more than the combined war indemnities collected in all European conflicts over the previous century. This Napoleon survived. The French Republic nearly didn't, and the method France used to pay that debt created a fiscal time bomb that would detonate 43 years later, killing 20 million people across the battlefields of World War I. You think World War I started with an assassination in Sarajevo? You're wrong. The Great War's fuse was lit 43 years earlier in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, not by a bullet, by a bill. 5 billion francs in gold, payable immediately. This wasn't diplomacy. This was financial execution designed to look like a peace treaty. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. The 1870 Prussian indemnity on France wasn't just the largest war payment in European history. It was the blueprint for every economic catastrophe that followed. Every debt crisis, every structural adjustment program, every punitive reparation scheme, every time a victorious nation decided to bleed a defeated one economically rather than militarily. It all traces back to Bismarck's innovation in 1871. Think Versailles 1919 was brutal. The Germans learned it from the French, who learned it from the Prussians. Think the IMF's handling of Greece in 2010 was harsh? Same playbook, different century. Think China's Belt and Road debt diplomacy is innovative? It's a Bismarck rerun with Chinese characteristics. The price of ignorance about this moment is staggering, because if you don't understand how France paid that indemnity, you cannot understand why World War I happened. You cannot understand why the 20th century became the bloodiest in human history. You cannot understand why your own government treats sovereign debt as a weapon instead of a number. France didn't pay 5 billion francs from national savings. They didn't have 5 billion francs, so they did something unprecedented. They sold their future. Borrowed from international banking syndicates at compound interest, auctioned off state assets, mortgaged colonial revenues for decades into the future. And who financed this national suicide? The Rothschilds, European banking houses, the same financial networks that would later orchestrate World War I's funding on both sides. The mathematical reality is devastating. France paid that indemnity with money that didn't exist yet, money their children and grandchildren would have to earn, money extracted through austerity, taxation, and colonial exploitation. The 5 billion francs transferred between 1871 and 1873 wasn't just gold changing hands. It was the future being sold to pay for the past, and that transaction created the economic pressures, the geopolitical tensions, and the financial architecture that made 1914 inevitable. This is the story of how one peace treaty became a 40-year time bomb, and when it finally exploded, 20 million people died. September 2nd, 1870. The Battle of Sedan. Napoleon III, Emperor of France, surrendered his sword to the Prussian king. 83,000 French soldiers became prisoners of war. The Second Empire collapsed in a single afternoon. Standard military defeat. Except it wasn't. Otto von Bismarck, Prussia's Iron Chancellor, understood something revolutionary. Conquering territory was expensive. Occupying foreign populations bred resistance. Traditional war indemnities were symbolic gestures, token payments that barely covered military costs. But what if you could conquer a nation's economy instead of its land? What if you could transform military victory into permanent fiscal dominance? Bismarck didn't want French provinces. He wanted French gold. All of it. Enough to cripple France for generations while simultaneously financing German industrial supremacy. This wasn't revenge. This was systematic economic engineering disguised as a peace settlement. The number wasn't arbitrary. Bismarck's economists conducted an exhaustive analysis of France's fiscal capacity. France's total annual government revenue in 1870 was approximately 20 billion francs. Their gold reserves held at the Banque de France totaled roughly 1.8 billion francs. Their yearly economic output was estimated at 25 billion francs. Bismarck demanded 5 billion francs in gold, payable in 3 years. With interest accumulating on unpaid balances, do mathematics. 5 billion francs represented 25% of France's annual economic output. It was nearly 3 times their total gold reserves. It exceeded their entire government budget for 2 years. This wasn't a payment France could make from existing wealth. This was an amount that would require France to liquidate assets, borrow extensively, raise taxes to crushing levels, and fundamentally restructure their entire economy. Bismarck had calculated the exact amount that would devastate without destroying. Too little, and France would recover quickly. Too much, and France would simply default, rendering the indemnity worthless. 5 billion francs was the perfect dose of economic poison. Enough to cripple France for decades, not enough to kill them outright. The Prussian finance ministry had run projections. If France somehow paid, those 5 billion francs would fund German military expansion, industrial development, and infrastructure construction for a generation. If France defaulted, Prussia would have legal justification for permanent occupation. Either outcome served German interests. The indemnity was designed so Prussia won regardless of whether France paid. May 10, 1871. The Treaty of Frankfurt formalized the indemnity. The document was a masterpiece of predatory legal design, 73 articles covering territory, reparations, and occupation terms. But 3 clauses created the financial trap. Article 1. France would pay 5 billion francs in gold to the German Empire. Not paper currency, not securities, physical gold. This specification was crucial. Paper money could be printed, securities could be negotiated. Gold had to be extracted from reserves, purchased on international markets, or physically mined. The gold requirement meant France couldn't inflate their way out of the debt. Article 2. Payment would occur in stages. 500 million francs immediately, then installments tied to specific deadlines. Final payment due by March 1874. The staged payment structure created continuous pressure. France couldn't simply make one massive effort and be done. They had to maintain crushing fiscal discipline for 3 consecutive years. Article 3. Interest would accrue at 5% annually on unpaid balances. 5% doesn't sound devastating until you compound it. If France delayed payment, the debt would grow exponentially. Every month of delay added millions to the total burden. But the truly diabolical clause was Article 7. Article 7 specified that German military forces would occupy 6 French departments until the indemnity was fully paid. The occupied territories included some of France's most productive industrial regions. Occupation would continue until the final gold payment was verified and accepted. This created a vicious cycle. Occupation was expensive. The French government had to pay for German occupation costs, estimated at 50 million francs monthly. So France was paying Germany to occupy France, while simultaneously trying to raise 5 billion francs to end that occupation. The occupied departments generated tax revenue that France desperately needed to pay the indemnity. But that revenue was disrupted by occupation. French businesses couldn't operate normally with German troops controlling the region. Bismarck had created a self-financing punishment system. The occupation paid for itself while increasing France's difficulty in raising the indemnity payment. The Treaty of Frankfurt also included provisions allowing Germany to seize French assets if payments were missed. French railways, ports, and customs revenues could be confiscated and operated by German authorities to extract payment directly. This was unprecedented in European diplomatic history. Previous peace treaties had involved territorial concessions or one-time payments. The Treaty of Frankfurt created an ongoing extraction mechanism with built-in enforcement. The treaty transformed military victory into permanent economic leverage. France wasn't just defeated, they were financially colonized. French negotiators understood exactly what they were signing. Adolphe Thiers, France's chief negotiator, reportedly said after signing, "We have signed our nation's economic death warrant. Our children will pay for the surrender with their futures." He was right. But even Thiers couldn't predict just how catastrophically right he was. The Treaty of Frankfurt didn't just end the Franco-Prussian War. It created the template for modern financial warfare. Every punitive debt instrument that followed, from Versailles to contemporary sovereign debt crises, borrowed from Bismarck's innovation. He had proven that you could destroy a nation without firing another shot. You just needed the right contract and enough leverage to enforce it. The gold would flow, the empire would bleed, and 40 years later, that blood debt would come due in the trenches of the Somme. Adolphe Thiers became France's provisional president in February 1871 with one mandate: pay the Prussians before the occupation bankrupted what remained of France. The mathematics were apocalyptic: 5 billion francs due within 3 years. France's entire gold reserve was 1.8 billion. The deficit was 3.2 billion francs that didn't exist. Thiers convened an emergency session with France's leading financiers, the Rothschilds, the Prairie brothers, every major banking house in Paris. The question wasn't whether France could pay. The question was what they'd have to destroy to generate the payment. The initial plan was straightforward taxation: raise income taxes, increase property taxes, impose emergency levies on wealth, extract the 5 billion from French citizens through the tax system. The projections came back devastating. Even with tax rates increased to confiscatory levels, France could raise perhaps 2 billion francs over 3 years. The remaining 3 billion would require something unprecedented. France would have to borrow its way out of debt, take loans from international banking syndicates, use future tax revenue as collateral, mortgage the nation's economic output for decades to pay a debt incurred in a 6-month war. Thiers understood the trap immediately. Borrowing to pay the indemnity meant France would pay interest on top of the original 5 billion. The true cost would be 7, 8, perhaps 10 billion francs once interest compounded over the repayment period. But there was no alternative. Default meant permanent German occupation. Delay meant accumulating interest on the indemnity itself. The only option was to pay fast, regardless of cost. The bleeding began immediately. June 1871. Thiers approached the Rothschild family, not just the French Rothschilds, the entire international network: Paris, London, Frankfurt, Vienna. The proposal was staggering. France needed to borrow 2.5 billion francs immediately. The Rothschilds would organize an international loan syndicate. Multiple banking houses across Europe would participate. France would repay with interest extracted from future tax revenues. The Rothschilds negotiated from a position of absolute power. France was desperate. The Prussians were occupying French territory. Every day of delay costs millions. The terms were predatory: interest rates of 6 to 8%, repayment periods of 15 to 25 years. The bonds would be backed by French customs revenues, railway income, and tobacco monopoly profits. This meant France was surrendering control of key revenue streams to foreign creditors. If France defaulted on the loans, the Rothschilds and their syndicate partners could seize French government assets directly. James de Rothschild, the French patriarch, understood the implications perfectly. He was essentially purchasing equity in the French state, not through conquest, through credit. The first Rothschild blood loan in June 1871 raised 2 billion francs. The subscription was oversubscribed within hours. Investors across Europe scrambled to buy French bonds despite the obvious risks. Why? Because the bonds were backed by a wealthy nation with immense resources. France might be defeated, but it still controlled colonies, operated railways, collected taxes. The collateral was solid even if the immediate situation was desperate. But here's what the bond buyers didn't understand. They were financing France's economic suicide. The Rothschild loans covered 2 billion francs. France still needed 3 billion more. Thiers launched the most aggressive asset liquidation program in modern history. Everything was for sale. State-owned railways were sold to private investors at massive discounts. Railway lines valued at 800 million francs sold for 450 million. The buyers were primarily British and German investors who understood they were purchasing French infrastructure at bankruptcy prices. Colonial concessions were auctioned. France sold mining rights in Algeria, timber rights in Indochina, trading monopolies in West Africa. These concessions generated revenue that should have flowed to the French treasury for decades. Instead, they were sold for immediate cash at fractions of their long-term value. The tobacco monopoly, one of France's most reliable revenue sources, was privatized. The government sold controlling interest to a consortium of French and foreign investors. The sale raised 320 million francs, but it cost France approximately 50 million francs in annual revenue permanently. Municipal bonds were issued in every major French city: Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, Toulouse. Local governments borrowed against future tax revenues to contribute to the national indemnity payment. Even individual French citizens were mobilized. The government launched a domestic bond drive. Patriotic appeals flooded newspapers. Save France, buy bonds, show the Prussians that France cannot be conquered financially. The campaign was brilliantly manipulative. It transformed paying the indemnity into an act of national pride. French citizens, many of them barely middle class, purchased bonds at interest rates far below what they could have earned elsewhere. They were essentially giving the government interest-free loans out of patriotism. Loans that would take decades to repay. Loans that in many cases would never be fully repaid because inflation would destroy their value. By September 1872, France had raised 4.8 billion francs through this combination of international loans, asset sales, and domestic bond drives. They were just 200 million francs short. The final gap was closed through direct taxation, an emergency property levy, a one-time wealth tax, increased customs duties. The French population absorbed the final burden directly through reduced living standards. September 5, 1873, France made the final indemnity payment, 2 years and 4 months after the Treaty of Frankfurt, 6 months ahead of the March 1874 deadline. The French government declared it a national triumph. Newspapers celebrated France's resilience. Politicians gave speeches about French determination and national character. France has proven that it cannot be conquered economically any more than militarily, Thiers proclaimed. We have paid the Prussian tribute ahead of schedule. We have restored our sovereignty. We have shown Europe that France remains a great power. The last German occupation troops left French soil on September 16, 1873. Crowds gathered to watch them depart. There were celebrations in Paris. Church bells rang across France. The illusion was complete. France had been defeated in war, forced to pay an unprecedented indemnity, and emerged believing they had achieved a moral victory by paying early. But the reality was catastrophic. France hadn't paid from wealth. They paid from debt. The 5 billion francs transferred to Germany between 1871 and 1873 had been raised through 2.5 billion in international loans at 6 to 8% interest, 1.2 billion in asset sales at massive discounts, 800 million in domestic bonds, 500 million in domestic bonds, 500 million in direct taxation. The international loans. Alone, it would cost France an additional 3 billion francs in interest payments over the next 25 years. The asset sales had surrendered revenue streams worth billions. The domestic bonds created obligations that would burden the French treasury for decades. The true cost of the 5 billion franc indemnity was somewhere between 12 and 15 billion francs once all secondary costs were calculated. France had paid Prussia 5 billion in gold, but France had paid itself 15 billion in lost future wealth. Worse, the loan structure meant France was now permanently indebted to international banking syndicates. The Rothschilds, British banks, German financial houses. They held French bonds. They collected interest from French tax revenues. They had first claim on French customs duties. France's sovereignty had been restored in name. In practice, French economic policy was now dictated by creditor interests. Any finance minister who proposed policies that threatened bond repayments would face immediate pressure from foreign banks. The German occupation had ended. A different kind of occupation had begun. Financial occupation by creditors who would extract wealth from France for the next half-century. And the 5 billion francs? They poured into Germany in gold coins and bullion between 1871 and 1873. That gold financed the German Industrial Revolution, built Krupp's steel mills, expanded German railways, modernized the German military. France had paid for its own future enemy. The gold extracted from French taxpayers and borrowed from international creditors would be transformed into German military superiority. By 1914, when those two nations faced each other again across trenches and barbed wire, France would be fighting an enemy it had inadvertently financed 40 years earlier. The early payment wasn't a triumph. It was national suicide with applause. There was another option. Nobody talks about it because France didn't take it. But it existed. France could have defaulted, simply refused to pay, declared the 5 billion franc indemnity illegitimate, excessive, and unpayable. Let Prussia keep occupying 6 departments indefinitely. Wait for international pressure to force a renegotiation. This wasn't fantasy. Sovereign default had historical precedent throughout the 19th century. Spain had defaulted on foreign debts 6 times between 1800 and 1870. The Ottoman Empire defaulted in 1875. Egypt defaulted in 1876. Russia would partially default in 1918. Nations that defaulted faced consequences. Credit ratings collapsed. Access to international loans disappeared for years. Trade relationships suffered. But none of these nations ceased to exist. None were permanently destroyed. And here's the crucial calculation Thiers never seriously considered. What could Prussia actually do if France defaulted? Reinvade? Impossible. The German military was exhausted from the 1870 war. German public opinion wouldn't support another invasion over unpaid debt. The international community, Britain especially, would condemn further German aggression. Permanent occupation? Unsustainable. Occupying 6 French departments cost Germany approximately 50 million francs annually. If France refused to pay that occupation cost, Germany would be hemorrhaging money to maintain troops in hostile territory indefinitely. Seize French assets? Limited options. Germany could confiscate property in the occupied departments. But the real French wealth was in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, far beyond German reach. The leverage Prussia held over France was almost entirely psychological. It depended on French elites believing that paying was preferable to the consequences of not paying. But Adolphe Thiers, the French banking establishment, and the political class never seriously evaluated default. Why? The answer lies in who controlled the decision-making process. Thiers wasn't making payment decisions in isolation. He was in constant consultation with France's financial elite. The Rothschilds, the Prieur brothers, the Banque de France governors, investment bank executives. These men had a vested interest in France paying the indemnity, not because they were patriots, because they would profit enormously from organizing the loan syndicates required to make payment possible. The Rothschild family alone earned approximately 80 million francs in fees from organizing the international loans that funded the indemnity payment. 80 million francs for acting as intermediaries between France and creditors. Other banking houses earned similar fees: bond underwriting commissions, loan arrangement fees, currency exchange profits. The entire French financial sector was positioned to extract wealth from the crisis. Default would have eliminated these profits. If France refused to pay, there would be no massive international loans, no bond syndicates, no underwriting fees. The financiers who advised Thiers on whether France could afford to pay were the same financiers who would profit from the payment mechanism. The conflict of interest was blatant and completely ignored. James de Rothschild sat in meetings with Thiers discussing France's options, while simultaneously calculating how much his family would earn from organizing the loans. He advocated for payment. He structured the loan syndicates. He collected massive fees. Then he used those fees to purchase French government bonds at discount prices, knowing that France's future tax revenues would be used to repay those bonds with interest. The Rothschilds weren't helping France escape Prussian occupation. They were replacing Prussian occupation with financial occupation where they were the occupiers. And once France committed to the payment strategy, once the loans were signed and the bonds were issued, default became genuinely impossible. Because now France owed money not just to Prussia, but to hundreds of creditors across Europe. Defaulting on the Prussian indemnity would have been a bilateral dispute with Germany. Defaulting on the Rothschild loans would have been a multilateral crisis involving Britain, Austria, Germany, Belgium, and dozens of banking houses. The Rothschilds had effectively taken France hostage, not through military force, through debt structure. Let's run the counterfactual honestly. What if France had defaulted on the indemnity and instead invested 5 billion francs into national development? 5 billion francs in 1871 was an incomprehensible sum. It represented the entire capital budget of the French state for nearly a decade. That money could have modernized French industry completely. The French railway network in 1870 was underdeveloped compared to Germany and Britain. 5 billion francs could have built 15,000 kilometers of new railway lines, connecting every major French city and port, creating an integrated national economy. French steel production in 1870 was one-third of German production. 5 billion francs invested in modern steel mills using Bessemer process technology could have tripled French steel output within a decade. French military technology was obsolete after the 1870 defeat. 5 billion francs could have re-equipped the entire French army with modern rifles, artillery, and logistics systems. French education was underfunded. 5 billion francs could have built 10,000 new schools, trained 50,000 new teachers, created a universal education system that would have produced the most educated workforce in Europe. The compounding effects of this investment would have been extraordinary. Better railways meant faster industrial development. Modern steel production meant competitive manufacturing. Superior military technology meant defensive security. Universal education meant long-term economic productivity. By 1914, France, with an extra 5 billion francs of 1870s investment, would have been economically stronger than Germany. The industries built with that capital would have been generating returns for 40 years. Instead, France paid 5 billion to Germany, then paid an additional 10 billion in interest and opportunity costs over the following decades. That 15 billion franc total cost represented wealth that could have transformed France into Europe's dominant industrial power. The opportunity cost of paying the indemnity was France's potential economic supremacy. But Thiers and the French political class never seriously considered these alternatives. Why? Because 19th century European elite culture operated on honor codes that made default psychologically impossible. Paying debts was a matter of national honor. Defaulting was shameful, dishonorable, the act of a degenerate nation that couldn't be trusted. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a deeply internalized belief. The French bourgeoisie, who controlled government and finance in 1871, genuinely believed that failing to pay debts was morally worse than impoverishing their own population to make payments. This honor culture served creditor interests perfectly. It meant debtor nations would destroy themselves trying to pay rather than default and preserve their resources. Thiers expressed this worldview explicitly in an 1871 speech. France's honor demands that we pay what we owe. A nation that defaults on its obligations forfeits its place among civilized powers. We will pay the Prussian indemnity regardless of cost, because France's reputation is worth more than gold. Read that again. France's reputation was worth more than gold, more than the welfare of French citizens, more than economic development, more than future prosperity. This was an ideological capture. The ruling class had internalized creditor ideology so completely that they couldn't distinguish between French national interests and creditor interests. The same pattern would repeat in 1919, when France imposed even harsher reparations on Germany. The same pattern continues today when the IMF imposes structural adjustment programs on debtor nations. The language changes, the mechanisms evolve, but the core dynamic remains identical. Creditors convince debtors that paying is honorable and defaulting is shameful. Then they extract everything. There was also class interest at work. The French bourgeoisie who would pay the indemnity through taxation were not the same people advising Thiers. The French working class and peasantry would bear the burden through consumption taxes, inflation, and reduced public services. The bourgeoisie would profit through loan fees, bond purchases, and asset acquisitions during the liquidation. Default would have distributed pain differently. The working class would have faced continued occupation of 6 departments, but they wouldn't have faced decades of crushing taxation. The bourgeoisie would have lost access to international credit markets, but they wouldn't have profited from organizing the payment. Thiers, himself a wealthy bourgeois with extensive financial connections, was making decisions that served his class interests while claiming to serve national interests. The counterfactual becomes clear. France should have defaulted, endured 5 or 10 years of German occupation in 6 departments while rebuilding their military and economy, waited for international pressure to force renegotiation of the indemnity. The costs would have been real. Continued occupation is harmful. Damaged credit is inconvenient, but these costs would have been temporary. The costs France actually paid by choosing to pay immediately were permanent. Decades of debt service, lost industrial development, surrender of economic sovereignty to foreign creditors. By 1914, France would have been wealthier, stronger, and more independent if they had defaulted in 1871, but that would have required France's ruling class to prioritize national welfare over personal profit and honor ideology, over rational calculation. They couldn't do it. The psychological and financial structures that trapped them were too powerful, so they paid. They bled their nation white to satisfy Prussian demands and enrich international bankers. They called it honor and patriotism. And 43 years later, when French soldiers were dying in trenches financed by debt that traced back to 1871, when France was fighting a German industrial machine built with French gold, the bill for that decision came due. The counterfactual wasn't taken. The alternative path wasn't chosen. And Europe paid for France's decision with 20 million dead. The 5 billion francs arrived in Germany between 1871 and 1873 in the form of gold coins, bullion bars, and bank transfers. Physical gold filled German treasury vaults in Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt. The amount was staggering. Germany's entire money supply in 1870 was approximately 2.5 billion marks. The French indemnity added roughly 4.25 billion marks in a span of 24 months. Germany's economy exploded. The period between 1871 and 1873 became known as the Gründerboom, the founders' boom. New companies formed at unprecedented rates. Stock exchanges went wild with speculation. Industrial expansion accelerated beyond anything Europe had seen. In 1870, Germany had 205 joint stock companies with a total capital of 2.4 billion marks. By 1873, Germany had 857 joint stock companies with a total capital of 5.1 billion marks. That's a 318% increase in 3 years. Where did the capital come from? French gold. The German government didn't hoard the indemnity payment. They spent it strategically. Military modernization received 800 million marks. Railway construction got 1.2 billion marks. Industrial subsidies totaled 600 million marks. But the real impact was psychological. The sudden influx of capital created a wealth effect that triggered massive private investment. German industrialists and investors, seeing government spending and flush treasury accounts, borrowed and invested aggressively. Krupp Steel expanded production capacity by 400% between 1871 and 1875. Their Essen facility became the largest steel mill in Europe. The financing came from German banks lending against the security of a gold-backed currency. German railway construction accelerated dramatically. In 1870, Germany had 19,500 kilometers of railway. By 1880, they had 33,800 kilometers. The expansion was financed by government bonds backed by indemnity gold and private investment attracted by government spending. German chemical companies, arms manufacturers, and heavy industry all experienced similar booms. The capital that built Germany's industrial might came directly or indirectly from French gold. By 1880, German steel production exceeded French production by 240%. German coal production was double France's output. German industrial capacity had surpassed Britain in several key sectors. France had paid 5 billion francs to end the German occupation. That payment financed the industrial base that would threaten France for the next 70 years. Meanwhile, France was bleeding. The loan repayments began immediately. By 1875, France was paying approximately 400 million francs annually just in interest on the loans taken to pay the indemnity. 400 million francs was roughly 20% of the French government's total annual revenue. 1/5 of everything the French state collected in taxes went to foreign creditors before any domestic spending occurred. This created impossible fiscal pressures. France needed to fund military rebuilding after the 1870 defeat. They needed infrastructure investment. They needed education, healthcare, and social services for a traumatized population, but 20% of revenue was gone before any of these needs could be addressed. The French government responded with austerity, slashed spending on everything. Veteran pensions were cut, infrastructure projects were cancelled, education budgets were frozen, public health spending declined. The economic impact was catastrophic. French GDP growth between 1872 and 1882 averaged 1.8% annually. German GDP growth in the same period averaged 4.2% annually. The gap widened every year. French per capita income stagnated. German per capita income surged. By 1890, the average German worker earned approximately 30% more than the average French worker. France needed new revenue sources desperately. The domestic economy couldn't generate enough tax revenue to cover debt service and necessary spending. The solution was colonial expansion. France had colonies before 1871: Algeria, Senegal, scattered territories in West Africa and Indochina. But after 1871, French colonial policy became systematic extraction designed to service debt. Tunisia was conquered in 1881, specifically to access phosphate deposits and agricultural land that could generate export revenue. Madagascar was seized in 1883 to control vanilla and spice production. French Indochina was expanded to exploit rubber plantations and rice production. The scramble for Africa intensified dramatically in the 1880s. France competed with Britain, Belgium, and Germany for African territories. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 divided Africa among European powers. France claimed vast territories across West and Central Africa, not for strategic reasons, for resource extraction. The colonial ventures were financed through additional borrowing. France issued colonial bonds to fund military expeditions and administrative infrastructure in Africa and Asia. The expectation was that colonial revenues would eventually exceed costs and contribute to debt repayment. This created a vicious cycle. France borrowed to finance colonial expansion. Colonial expansion generated some revenue, but also required ongoing military and administrative spending. The net contribution to French finances was minimal, but the strategy persisted because alternatives didn't exist. By 1900, France controlled the second-largest colonial empire in the world after Britain. 11 million square kilometers of territory, populations totaling approximately 50 million people under French rule. This wasn't empire building for glory. This was debt-driven desperation disguised as imperial ambition. The French indemnity created an unexpected problem for Germany. The massive capital influx had made Germany wealthy and powerful, but it also made German military planners paranoid. Here's the paradox. Germany's military strategists watched France's colonial expansion with growing alarm. France was acquiring territories, building armies in Africa and Asia, extracting resources. German intelligence estimated that by 1890, France was generating approximately 800 million francs annually from colonial revenues. Not all of this was profit. Much went to colonial administration, but it represented a growing revenue stream outside European taxation. German military planners understood what this meant. France was rebuilding its economic capacity through imperial extraction. Eventually, France would recover from the 1871 defeat. Eventually, France would seek revenge. The German General Staff began planning for inevitable conflict with France, but they faced a strategic nightmare. France was allied with Russia as of 1894. Germany faced a potential two-front war. Fighting France and Russia simultaneously was Germany's worst-case scenario. The Schlieffen Plan, developed between 1891 and 1905, was designed to solve this problem through speed and violence. The plan required Germany to defeat France in 6 weeks through Belgium, then shift forces east to fight Russia before Russian mobilization completed. It was an all-or-nothing strategy that required perfect execution and absolute commitment. But here's what's rarely discussed. The Schlieffen Plan's urgency came directly from French economic recovery, funded by colonial extraction, which itself was driven by the need to service debt from the 1871 indemnity. If France hadn't paid the indemnity, if France had defaulted and invested those resources domestically, France would have been stronger in 1871, but wouldn't have needed desperate colonial expansion in the 1880s and 1890s. The colonial scramble brought France into conflict with German colonial ambitions. Competition over Morocco in 1905 and 1911 nearly triggered war twice. German paranoia about encirclement, about Franco-Russian alliance, about French recovery, all of it traced back to the wealth dynamics created by the indemnity. By 1910, the strategic situation in Europe had become a powder keg. Germany was surrounded by potential enemies, France to the west, Russia to the east. Britain allied with France. Austria-Hungary was Germany's only reliable ally. German military expenditure between 1900 and 1914 increased by 220%. Naval construction accelerated as Germany attempted to challenge British maritime supremacy. Army expansion added millions of conscripts. Artillery production quintupled. The financing for this militarization came from the industrial base built with French gold in the 1870s. Krupp Steel supplied artillery. German chemical companies provided explosives. German railway capacity enabled rapid mobilization. France, meanwhile, was militarizing just as aggressively. French military spending increased by 180% between 1900 and 1914. The French army expanded. Artillery modernized. Defensive fortifications along the German border were strengthened. French militarization was financed partly through taxation, partly through additional borrowing, and partly through colonial extraction. Both nations were preparing for war. Both nations' preparation was financed by economic structures created by the 1871 indemnity. The arms race became self-reinforcing. Germany built up military capacity because they feared French revenge and Russian expansion. France built up military capacity because they feared German aggression and wanted to recover Alsace-Lorraine lost in 1871. The 1871 indemnity had created the initial imbalance. French payment financed German industrial growth. German industrial growth enabled German military superiority. The French response required colonial extraction and further borrowing. Colonial competition increased tensions. Military buildups accelerated. By 1914, both nations were economically structured around military preparation. Industrial production was increasingly oriented toward weapons. Government budgets were dominated by military spending. Diplomatic relationships were defined by alliance systems designed for war. The July crisis of 1914, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, became catastrophic because the underlying economic and military structures made wars seem inevitable to decision-makers on all sides. Germany's decision to implement the Schlieffen Plan, to invade Belgium and France immediately rather than seeking diplomatic resolution, came from decades of planning based on the assumption that a two-front war with France and Russia was Germany's existential threat. That assumption originated in the strategic environment created by the 1871 indemnity. The wealth transfer that made Germany powerful and France desperate. The colonial scramble that brought European powers into constant conflict. The debt structures that made both nations economically fragile despite military power. When the guns started firing in August 1914, the bullets were paid for with gold transferred from France to Germany 43 years earlier. The trenches were dug by soldiers conscripted into armies built with that gold. The artillery shells were forged in steel mills financed by that gold. The 1871 indemnity didn't cause World War I directly, but it created the economic architecture, the strategic paranoia, and the military infrastructure that made the war inevitable. 5 billion francs in gold, transferred between 1871 and 1873, became 20 million corpses scattered across European battlefields between 1914 and 1918. The price of peace in 1871 was paid in blood in 1914. The 5 billion francs didn't come from the wealthy. It came from everyone else. Between 1871 and 1890, the French government imposed what historians call the invisible extraction, a network of indirect taxes, price increases, and service cuts that transferred wealth from French workers and peasants to pay creditors. The salt tax was reinstated in 1872. Salt had been a revolutionary grievance in 1789, the hated symbol of royal oppression. The Third Republic brought it back because salt taxes were reliable revenue. Every French household needed salt. Consumption was predictable. The tax added approximately 15 francs annually to the average household budget. 15 francs doesn't sound catastrophic until you realize the average French worker earned 900 francs per year. The salt tax alone consumed 1.7% of working-class income. The tobacco monopoly became more aggressive. Prices increased by 30% between 1872 and 1875. The government's tobacco revenue jumped from 180 million francs annually to 285 million francs. Who smoked? Working-class men, factory workers, day laborers, the people least able to absorb price increases. Alcohol taxes increased by 40%. Wine, brandy, beer, all taxed more heavily. The French government calculated that alcohol consumption was relatively inelastic. People would keep drinking despite higher prices. They were right. Alcohol consumption declined only marginally. Revenues surged, and working-class budgets were squeezed further. These indirect taxes were deliberately regressive. They hit the poor harder than the rich because poor families spent larger percentages of income on necessities like salt, tobacco, and alcohol. A wealthy Parisian might spend 5% of income on these taxed goods. A working-class family in Lyon might spend 20%. The tax burden fell overwhelmingly on those least able to pay, but direct taxation increased too. Property taxes rose by 18% between 1871 and 1875. Income taxes, though limited in scope, increased for the small percentage of French citizens who earned enough to qualify. The total tax burden on French citizens increased by approximately 35% between 1871 and 1880. 35% more of their income extracted by the state to service debt incurred paying the Prussian indemnity. Taxation alone couldn't generate enough revenue. The French government also slashed spending. Veteran pensions were the first casualty. France had approximately 380,000 veterans from the 1870 war, wounded soldiers, men who'd fought at Sedan, at Metz, in the feudal defense of Paris. Their pensions were cut by an average of 22% in 1873. The government claimed fiscal necessity. The veterans were told their sacrifice was appreciated, but France couldn't afford full pensions while paying the indemnity. One veteran, a former infantry sergeant who'd lost his left arm at Gravelotte, wrote to a Paris newspaper in 1874, "I gave my arm for France. The government gives me 140 francs annually. This is not enough to survive. I must beg. I fought the Prussians. Now I fight hunger. Which enemy is worse?" Public health spending collapsed. France had been slowly building a modern public health system in the 1860s. Hospitals, vaccination programs, quarantine infrastructure. Funding was slashed by 40% between 1871 and 1876. Hospital beds were reduced. Medical staff was cut. Vaccination programs were suspended in rural areas. The result was predictable. Disease outbreaks that should have been contained became epidemics. A smallpox outbreak in 1872 killed an estimated 90,000 French citizens. Many deaths were preventable. Vaccination programs that had been operational in 1870 were no longer funded. Cholera outbreaks in 1873 and 1884 killed thousands more. Inadequate sanitation infrastructure combined with reduced public health spending created conditions for epidemic disease. The French government never officially connected these deaths to austerity policies, but the correlation was undeniable. Deaths from preventable disease increased precisely when public health spending declined to service debt. Education spending was frozen. France needed to expand education to compete with Germany's superior schooling system. Instead, education budgets were locked at 1870 levels despite population growth and inflation. The result was overcrowded classrooms, underpaid teachers, and declining educational quality. Rural schools were particularly affected. Many closed entirely due to lack of funding. An entire generation of French children received inferior education because resources were directed to debt repayment instead of schools. The talented left. Engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, anyone with portable skills who could find opportunities elsewhere. Between 1872 and 1885, an estimated 320,000 French citizens emigrated. Most went to the Americas, the United States, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Brazil, Canada. This wasn't the traditional pattern of poor agricultural workers seeking land. This was skilled, middle-class immigration. People who had futures in France but saw better futures elsewhere. One emigrant, a civil engineer named Philippe Perrot, explained his decision in an 1876 letter. "I can earn 3,200 francs annually in Lyon, assuming I find work. The same position in New York pays equivalent to 5,800 francs. France taxes me at increasingly confiscatory rates to pay debts I did not incur. Why should I stay?" French doctors immigrated to avoid the stagnant medical system. French chemists left for German and British universities that offered better research funding. French industrial engineers left for American and British companies that paid higher wages. The brain drain created a vicious cycle. France lost its most productive citizens. This reduced economic output. Lower output meant lower tax revenue. Lower revenue meant higher tax rates on those who remained. Higher tax rates encouraged more emigration. German and British companies actively recruited French engineers and scientists. They understood France's fiscal crisis created opportunities. Offer competitive salaries to talented French workers trapped in a stagnant economy. Brain drain France. Strengthen your own industrial capacity. By 1890, French innovation and patent production had declined relative to Germany and Britain. Not because French people were less talented, because the talented French people were increasingly working elsewhere. The demographic impact was devastating. French birth rates declined sharply after 1871. In 1870, France had a birth rate of 25.9 births per thousand population. By 1880, the rate had fallen to 23.4 per thousand. By 1890, it was 21.8 per thousand. Why? Economic insecurity. Young couples delayed marriage and children because they couldn't afford families. The average age at first marriage for French women increased from 24.3 years in 1870 to 25.8 years by 1890. For men, it increased from 27.1 years to 28.6 years. Delayed marriage meant fewer children per family. Smaller families meant slower population growth. Germany's birth rate remained stable at approximately 27 births per thousand throughout the same period. Germany's population grew faster than France's. By 1914, Germany had 65 million people. France had 40 million. The population gap, driven partly by economic factors stemming from the indemnity crisis, translated directly into military manpower. France would enter World War I with a smaller pool of soldiers than Germany, partially because French parents in the 1870s and 1880s couldn't afford to raise large families. Infant mortality increased. France's infant mortality rate in 1870 was approximately 180 deaths per thousand live births. By 1880, it had increased to 195 per thousand. Why? Malnutrition, inadequate healthcare, reduced public health spending. Families struggling with increased tax burdens couldn't afford adequate nutrition for children. One Parisian doctor wrote in an 1883 medical journal, "I see children dying from diseases that should not kill. Pneumonia, dysentery, measles. They die because their families cannot afford adequate food, clean water, or medical care. The tax burden has made poverty deadly." The children who survived grew up shorter and less healthy than previous generations. Military recruitment records show that French conscripts in the 1890s averaged 165 centimeters tall. Conscripts in the 1860s had averaged 167 centimeters. 2 centimeters might seem trivial, but height is a proxy for childhood nutrition. The declining average height indicated worsening childhood health outcomes across the entire population. Educational achievement declined as well. Literacy rates, which had been improving steadily through the 1860s, stagnated in the 1870s and 1880s due to reduced school funding. France entered the 20th century with a generation that was less educated, less healthy, and smaller in number than it should have been. The 5 billion francs paid to Prussia wasn't extracted from gold vaults. It was extracted from the bodies of French children, from reduced nutrition, from closed schools, from preventable diseases, from families that were never formed because young couples couldn't afford children. The human cost of the indemnity was measured in stunted growth, preventable debts, and lost potential. The Prussians received their gold. French citizens paid with their lives, their health, and their futures. By 1914, when those surviving children became soldiers, they marched to war carrying the physical and economic scars of their parents' generation's debt. The indemnity wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a 40-year extraction of human vitality disguised as fiscal responsibility. And nobody was ever held accountable. The bankers who profited died wealthy. The politicians who chose payment over default were celebrated. The Prussians kept their gold. Only the French people paid the real price. May 7, 1919. The Palace of Versailles. Again, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau handed the German delegation a document. The Treaty of Versailles. Article 231 was the critical clause. Germany accepted sole responsibility for the war. Germany would pay reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks, approximately $32 billion, payable over decades. The amount was deliberately impossible. Economist John Maynard Keynes, present at the negotiations, calculated that Germany's entire annual economic output couldn't service the debt. Payment would require Germany to run permanent trade surpluses while surrendering industrial capacity. Clemenceau didn't care. He wanted Germany crippled, permanently weakened, unable to threaten France again. Does this sound familiar? It should. It was the 1871 Prussian indemnity multiplied by 26. France had learned the lesson perfectly. Punitive debt works. It destroys enemies economically. It extracts wealth for generations. It creates permanent strategic advantage. Except it didn't work. The Versailles reparations triggered German hyperinflation between 1921 and 1923. The German mark became worthless. Savings evaporated. The middle class was destroyed. Economic chaos created the conditions for extremism. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was financed by resentment over Versailles. His core political message was simple. Germany was humiliated by unjust debt imposed by vengeful enemies. National revival required repudiation of that debt and the system that imposed it. The 1871 indemnity led to World War I. The 1919 reparations led to World War II. Same mechanism, same logic, larger scale. Punitive debt doesn't create stability. It creates time bombs. Fast forward to 1982, the Latin American debt crisis. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of other developing nations had borrowed heavily during the 1970s. When interest rates spiked and commodity prices collapsed, they couldn't service their debts. The International Monetary Fund offered rescue packages, loans to prevent default, but the loans came with conditions. Structural adjustment programs, cut government spending, privatize state assets, eliminate subsidies, raise taxes, open markets to foreign competition, guaranteed debt repayment to foreign creditors above all other priorities. Read those conditions again. They're identical to what France did in 1871. Asset liquidation, austerity, prioritizing creditor payments over citizen welfare. The results were identical too. Economic contraction, rising poverty, social unrest. The lost decade of the 1980s in Latin America devastated an entire generation. Meanwhile, foreign creditors were repaid. International banks recovered their loans with interest. The debt wasn't forgiven. It was restructured, extended, and eventually paid through decades of extraction. The IMF wasn't helping debtor nations. It was enforcing the Bismarck model. Use debt as leverage. Extract maximum payment. Call it fiscal responsibility. The Greek debt crisis. Greece had borrowed heavily to finance government spending in the 2004 Olympics. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Greek revenues collapsed. They couldn't repay debts to German and French banks. The European Union and IMF offered a bailout, 110 billion euros in loans. The conditions: savage austerity, cut pensions by 40%, slash public sector wages, sell state assets, privatize ports, airports, and utilities. Greek unemployment reached 27%. Youth unemployment hit 58%. The economy contracted by 25%. Suicide rates doubled. Malnutrition appeared in Greek cities for the first time since World War II. Who benefited? German and French banks that held Greek debt. They were repaid in full. The bailout money flowed to Greece directly to creditors. Greece became France in 1871, forced to sell assets at crisis prices, forced to impose austerity that destroyed a generation, forced to prioritize creditor payments over citizen welfare. The Greek people never voted for the debts. They didn't cause the crisis, but they paid for it, just like French peasants in 1871 paid for a war they didn't start. Same playbook, same victims, same predators. Here's what you need to understand. The 1870 Prussian indemnity wasn't ancient history. It was the prototype for the modern global financial system. Every time a debtor nation is forced to choose between defaulting and destroying its own economy, that's the Bismarck model. Every time international creditors demand austerity as the price of lending, that's the Rothschild trap. Every time debt service is prioritized over healthcare, education, or infrastructure, that's the 1871 logic. The mechanisms have evolved. The institutions have different names, but the core dynamic is identical. Debt is power. Creditors are occupiers. Payment is extraction disguised as responsibility. China's Belt and Road Initiative operates on the same principle: loan money to developing nations for infrastructure projects. When they can't repay, seize the ports, the roads, the resources. It's called debt trap diplomacy. It's the Prussian indemnity with Chinese characteristics. The United States uses dollar dominance the same way. Countries need dollars to trade internationally. The US controls dollar supply. This gives America leverage over sovereign nations without firing a shot. The lesson from 1871 is this: debt is the most efficient weapon ever invented. It's cheaper than war. It's more permanent than occupation. It extracts wealth continuously without the messiness of military force. And nobody ever calls it what it is: conquest. The 5 billion francs transferred from France to Prussia between 1871 and 1873 killed 20 million people 40 years later. Not directly, but the economic architecture created by that transfer made the war inevitable. Today's debt architecture is larger, more complex, and more dangerous. Sovereign debt exceeds $70 trillion globally. Most of it will never be repaid. The question is how the inevitable defaults and restructurings will be handled. Will creditors demand full payment through austerity and asset liquidation? That's the 1871 model. It leads to economic collapse, social unrest, and eventually war. Or will debt be forgiven, restructured fairly, with losses shared between creditors and debtors? That's the alternative. It's never been tried on a large scale. The choice we face now is the same choice France faced in 1871. Pay and destroy your future, or default and face immediate consequences. France chose payment. Europe paid in blood. So here is the question that defines our financial world, and I want your honest answer. Who was the real villain of 1871? Was it Bismarck, the calculating chancellor who weaponized debt to cripple an enemy? Or was it Thiers and the Rothschilds who convinced France that paying was honorable when default might have saved a generation? Who would you have advised in 1871? Pay the indemnity and mortgage the future, or default and endure immediate occupation? It's a choice between slow suicide and painful survival. I'm reading your comments below to see which side you take, and if this deep dive into the 1870 indemnity changed the way you look at sovereign debt, at IMF programs, at China's Belt and Road, hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that this history actually matters today. Because whether it's 1871 or 2026, the mathematics remain the same. We are still caught in a world where debt is power and payment is surrender. A world where the only real evidence left behind is the paper trail. A trail that leads us directly back to a French gold Napoleon from 1871, sitting in a vault, waiting to tell its story.